questions now. So each panelist is able to ask the questions. Some of them are focused more on the transfusion medicine side. Some are focused on the LGBTQ plus side. So I will let you know, if we want both panelists, but we do want this conversation to essentially be like a conversation. So if we get off, topic a little bit, we get off the questions, that's okay. We want that. We want that conversation going back and forth so we understand each other. So I'll ask the first question. Our first section is on the past history and context about the original MSM ban. I gave you a little bit of a long history actually, but panelists, what additional historical nuances would you like to add about the ban, now deferral, regarding its initial implementation? So Dr. Gammon, would you like to start with that?
Yes, I pulled some historical information. I wasn't a physician at the time. What I have is that the American Hemophilia Foundation spoke out against gay donors in March of 1983. This led to the U.S. Public Health Service, the parent agency of both the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the Food and Drug Administration, to issue recommendations that groups at increased risk of AIDS refrain from donating. It included were persons with signs and symptoms of AIDS, male homosexuals, and patients with hemophilia.
Very interesting. I did not know that as well. So that's good information. Dr. Custer, what would you like to say?
Well, first of all, hello, everybody, and I'm very happy to be a part of this. I think it is going to be a valuable conversation. I will add a couple, since I have been a researcher working actively in this area for a very long time, I'm going to add just a couple of additional points for consideration. Early on, when we really did not know it was HIV, yes, it was considered AIDS. Actually, Haitians were deferred. They were deferred for the same reason. It's like we did not know. And so anybody that was perceived to have a higher risk of AIDS was not allowed to donate. That definitely changed. That was the period of 1983 to 1985. From 1985 until the change to the one-year deferral, then it was just a, as you want to call it, blanket ban for just men who have sex with men. But the policy itself has changed. It's from the inception, it's been a challenging policy. And again, the example with excluding an entire population was not perhaps well conceived, but it was what was felt at the time to be the best scientific evidence. I don't think any of us agree with that evidence looking back from this perspective we have today.
Thank you for that. I will call on Dr. Wes Mitchell now.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you very much for having me. I do agree, very valuable. And I'm fangirling a little bit because everybody on this call is more famous than I am. So I'm very glad to be included here. The first thing I probably should say is that the views expressed are my own and do not represent those of the United States federal government or the HHS or the NIH. They're mine. I guess we will talk more fluidly, right, about the history of the AIDS. It's interesting. You use the word ban. It's not a blood banking word. So I'm trying to, bear in mind that that's the term that you're using, meaning the indefinite deferral. In other words, if it's never, you would say ban versus deferral, we would say like a temporary deferral is how we would use that information. But so we will talk about the history. And I think there are facts that we may be able to add here. But I wanted to make the point that as a blood bank doc, which is what I am, I'm not a major researcher in this field like Dr. Custer and Dr. Gammon, who have a lot of history here. But I'm speaking, I think, here as a transfusion medicine doctor working in a hospital-based blood bank, albeit in a research facility. What I'm hoping to do here is to learn more about what it is that we have not been able to see from our side of the table. I think we can talk about the data, the history, the numbers, sensitivity, specificity, and positive and negative predictive value of testing. And that is information that's important, but I would really like to hear the other side of the table because I think just from my own experience, I think we have a tendency to think in a very I'd say measurement centric way. We think about adverse reactions. We think about donors fainting. We think about positive test results, those things do matter. But there are other things that we can't necessarily measure. And that information, I think, is what is important to discuss today. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and I agree. So with that, Jason, what do you have to say?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me in GMHC, and hello to all the panelists. I've read and seen your quotes and your work, so it's really exciting to actually see and meet you and be able to do this. So thanks to UBI, Howard Law, and OUTLaw for making this happen. I want to share a brief story because I think with GMHC, what I can represent best are both LGBTQ plus perspectives and HIV prevention perspectives. In 1992 or 1993, when I was in high school, my school had a blood drive, and as many schools did, and many schools still do. Now, at that time, I was being forced to attend what is now known as ex-gay or conversion therapy by a fundamentalist Christian family. And I was very afraid of what it meant to be gay. You know, right? I was told and thought it would mean that I would essentially get AIDS and die and go to hell. So imagine my surprise when I sat down with the person who was facilitating the donor history questionnaire, who said, you know, have you had sex with another man? I'm going to forget the exact year here, since is it 1978, I think, 75, something like that.
77.
Thank you very much. I would have gotten there. And you know, if you could have seen the look on my face, I'm sure I turned white and my jaw dropped. And I remember thinking, how does this person know? How do they know? Did my family tell them? Did the kids at school who were calling me all horrible names, did they say something? And what that facilitated in me was another layer of all the messaging that I had received, that being gay was bad, that being gay was to be diseased, and that I was a terrible person. Now, flash forward to 40 years or so later, well, 30 from then. I have a son who also happens to be gay. He's 16 years old, and he recently became sexually active. And were he to, when he's eligible or out of age, go to donate blood, he would have the exact same experience that I did as his father. And that breaks my heart. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Jason, and understandable about your past and your views and everything that's gotten you this far, and especially your son. So, Christy, is there anything else you would like to add?
Really, I just wanted to thank everybody for this opportunity to discuss this topic. I think this is something that's definitely needs to be discussed and needs to be talked about and needs to be understood. I come at this from, I guess, both sides. From the transfusion medicine side, having lots of experience with transfusion medicine, but again, also just being an ally to the LGBTQ plus community. I think it's important that we get this out there and we really start questioning some of the things that, some of the laws we have in place and some of the rulings we have in place to really kind of get this at the forefront and really understand, why this is still an issue for us in the community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So our next question is, why was the ban focused only on men who had sex with men? For an example, we're another group with high rates of HIV being another population in which the disease was first identified, where they are not treated the same. So essentially, why was it only focused on them first? And I will let Dr. Custer go first.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, so of course, as I was indicating, originally it was more mixed, but then it did become very specific to men who have sex with men. And so I do think from the standpoint of everything we'll talk about from here on, it really should be focused on what was in place from 1985 on. For better or worse, the reality was the epidemiology of HIV infection, particularly at the time, was that the highest risk was in a population of men who have sex with men. And as those of you, I was alive at that time. I was not eligible to be a blood donor. This is a whole different story. The testing was not very good. It is the reality, right? So it was antibody testing, it was first generation and then second generation antibody testing. We can get into the specifics of what that means. It just meant that there was a larger period of time where somebody could have become infected and we would not be able to detect it. And so the FDA is a risk-averse organization. I'm not here defending them. I'm just telling you the way it is. And it is that risk aversion that drives the way policies are made. And so the policy was made at that time. And I still think that might have been the right policy at the time, but I will tell you that I don't think that that was the right policy several years later. And so it's really been a history of the drag effect, if you will, of not being able to change a policy once it is implemented that I think is something that we should discuss.
Absolutely, I agree. I know that Christy, you have some experience on the inferior testing and stuff. So maybe if you want to dive into that a little bit about, the changes and with the testings like.
Sure. As Dr. Custer alluded to, when testing first became available, which was 1985, we came up with an ELISA test, which was for antibodies. But again, it was, an inferior test. The window period that was discussed, we're looking at 23 to 90 days. So what that means is somebody could become infected with HIV, but it would not be detectable by the testing from 23 to 90 days. Basically, the amount of time it would take for a person to mount an antibody defense. So as we move on from 1985, in 1987, we saw the Western blot, which again, it shortened that window period a little bit, gave us a confirmatory test, but still not perfect. In 1999, we had the introduction of our first NAT test, and that's where we actually tested things on more of a genetic level. As these tests progress, again, NAT testing gets a little bit better as we go along, but as this testing has progressed, we're now at a point where the window period on these tests are from about 9 to 11 days. So in 1985, like I said, it was about 23 to 90 days versus now it's 9 to 11 days from onset to detection, just to give everybody a little bit of an idea about the testing that's progressed.
Thank you so much. That was really about the testing and kind of where the history is and where it's at now. Dr. Wes Mitchell, is there anything you would like to add to that?
About testing in particular, I guess I think everything Chrissy said, of course, it's a very good summary of what was in place. I want to just say a few things. Genetic means the genome of the infectious agents. I only say that because we've had donors who are like, why are you going to do this? Like the other things have genes, not just you. So we'd be looking for like the genes of, viruses. So that's one thing. And that is better, right? Like isn't you're picking that up before you pick up the antibody, which is one thing you make. Your immune system has to be exposed to something and it says, goodness, what's this? Oh, and then you make a response. And so that takes a longer time. And that's why the nucleic acid or the genetic testing can pick up potential pathogens in blood faster, which has helped tremendously. And I think the only thing I would say there is that even though the tests are now very good, they're still not perfect. So as much as we want to make sure that we have an equitable and sustainable blood supply, we just want to make sure that there's still an awareness that the tests aren't perfect. I'm saying this as a person coming from another country. I'm not American. I know my American accent is very impressive and convincing, but I'm not from here. I come from the third world, and people come in to donate and will literally look you in your face and tell you, hey, listen, I went somewhere and I met somebody and it was really sus. So y'all test, right? So you're gonna tell me if I'm thinking, I'm like, okay, honey pie, can't say honey pie, not in America either. Can't say that to you. Okay, dear, person. If you would like free testing, so we started doing free testing in the blood bank because we didn't want people to feel, you came in here, people say you didn't donate. What happened? You can get a test, but just understand that the tests aren't perfect, even though they are much better now. They're not perfect. So if you did something yesterday, don't come in today. I'm not saying that anybody on this panel would be saying so, but they just, as things get better, we don't want to swing the other way either. That people think that, oh, now there's no risk anymore. I mean, yes, the risk has become very, very low, but we'd like to keep it that way. So that's, I think, what I'd say about that. But yeah, a totally different landscape than it was in the 80s. I was also alive, but entirely too young to donate.
Thank you so much for that. So again, we kind of want to have a newest conversation about this. So after, kind of our transfusion medicine side, and Christian has just joined on, so he has now just joined on. We just started with a question, why the ban focused only on men who had sex with other men. We talked a little bit about the testing. So Jason or Christian, is there any questions that you have for the transfusion medicine side right now?
The question I have may just be more of educating myself and hopefully others with the history. What was it that made the deferral of Haitians lift at that time?
Okay, so that's a difficult question, Jason. The ultimate answer is, while it was still recognized that there was a higher risk, it was thought that it was not as high. So if I was alive, again, I covered that. I actually remember the newscasts about exclusively asking Haitians not to donate and how offensive that was. I mean, that was just flat out a racist policy. So it may be honestly that it was a more willingness to say that the racism wasn't justified. Some latent homophobia may have been more acceptable at the time. And I don't know. I'm viewing this through the lens of not a very mature brain at the time. So, but I remember it. And so all we know is actually it was changed. And I think probably if you really get to the large focus, it would be the proportion of the population who would be coming in to donate, who would be of Haitian descent versus potentially men who have sex with men, that the numbers were just so much smaller that it was the concern about the expanding HIV epidemic in the MSM population that sort of shifted the focus to be exclusively on men who have sex with men.
Thank you, Dr. Custer.
And during this time, if anybody else has questions for each of, the communities, please reach out. That is what we're here for. So I don't need to prompt you. But I will prompt a little bit if I need to. And since then, we will essentially then go on to the next question. And Jason and Christian, this will be focused more on your thoughts and stuff. So now the MSM ban or deferral, since its initial inception, has been a focus of great deal and attention within the LGBTQ plus community. Why does it matter so much? When did the advocacy pushing for the policy change start, and what did it look like early on? And I'll start with Jason.
Thanks, Erin. When people have sex under the cover of shame and fear, that is often not a healthy outcome for them and not a good public health outcome. So, that edges into, well, why is GMHC, an HIV and AIDS services organization, so involved and vocal on this? And when you look at all that has been achieved in the fight to end the HIV and AIDS epidemic, the focus on those who are living with HIV being linked to care, staying on their medication, undetectable equals untransmissible, the focus on PrEP and PEP and other technologies to keep folks who are at high risk negative. There's been tremendous progress in reducing the number of infections, but it has not reached the point of kind of statistical ending the epidemic. And we see, just as has happened for COVID-19 and then the monkeypox outbreak, which we refer to as MPV, HIV has concentrated among communities who are often stigmatized minority groups who are mistreated, vilified in society, low-income people of color, undocumented immigrants, transgender, gender nonconforming, sex workers. And so the real question is, well, how do we address what's causing HIV transmission among those groups to end the HIV epidemic? And there are a variety of structural drivers or things that we look to that are much bigger picture that produce or help to push certain public health outcomes. And we know that one of them is stigma and discrimination, shame, fear, anxiety. And as I opened with, what does it mean to my 16-year-old son to learn that he would not be able to donate blood? What does that tell him, even if hopefully he has been supported by myself and my husband to not be ashamed of his sexuality, how to protect himself and others during sexual encounters, and remain free from HIV and other STIs. What effect does that have on him? I think the answer to that is pretty obvious, and that is the effect that it has on so many men who have sex with men, bisexual men, men who don't use those terms to define who they are, but are potentially have been exposed to HIV. So what it means to the LGBTQ community and to the focus on ending HIV is the federal government with its current policy is supporting a structural driver of the HIV epidemic in its attempt to prevent the spread of HIV via blood transfusion, for which there's very low risk right now, and has been for some time. It is actually perpetuating other aspects of the HIV and AIDS epidemic that lead to people becoming infected. And that's one of the key reasons why GMHC has been involved.
Thank you for the insights. And so, Christian, what about your personal perspective on this? And maybe, you writing for the Chicago Tribune and everything.
Yeah, so I know that obviously as someone who's part of the LGBTQ plus community, I have been aware of this deferral policy for men who have sex with men and their inability to donate blood. And that was something I have known about since I was pretty young. And I remember when I decided to write this op-ed for the Chicago Tribune, I had some of my friends and I had my brother read it. And a lot of them were surprised that this was a policy. I think that there is just general unawareness of the fact that the blood transfusion or the blood donation policies are super strict. So I think that writing this was a chance for me to look deeper into a topic that has impacted me, and also the chance to write about something that I think that a lot of people in general are just unaware of. And kind of going off of what Jason was saying, I remember in a session before today, Dr. Wes Mitchell mentioned, what is considered harm, right? Is not allowing men who have sex with men to donate blood, is that considered harm? Because it's not like by being unable to donate blood that, people are being hurt directly. And so I would argue kind of with what Jason was saying, that this form of social exclusion is a type of harm. And I think that it really does cast a stigma on men who have sex with men. And it lets them know that, we trust you to we trust you to be healthcare workers. We trust you to be nurses, teachers. We trust you to be all these really important positions in society, but we don't trust you to do something as simple as donating blood. And I think that that stigma is very harmful. And I would also argue that it can also be harmful to patients who are in desperate need of blood products. Just today in class, we had a lecture, it's pretty funny timing, we had a lecture on transfusion medicine. And at the end of the lecture, our lecturer was saying, if you're eligible to donate blood, please do so. Around 38% of Americans are eligible, but less than 10% donate, and there's a big shortage. So there is this acute need for blood products, but unfortunately, there is a group of people and a very willing population who wants to help, but unfortunately, because of this policy, is not able to. So I think that just writing about this was a chance for me to let people know that this is an issue that is impacting a lot of people.
Thank you for your insight on that. Does anybody else have any questions for them from the transfusion medicine side?
Yeah, this is Brian. I guess I'd like to make two comments. One is very important for everybody to recognize that I am a gay man also. But what you just spoke about, Christian and Jason, while those are highly relevant, so what has inculcated, what has made this policy what it is the fact that in the 80s and early 90s, HIV was transmitted by transfusion to a large number of individuals in the US and globally. And that is the mistake that people do not want to have happen again. Doesn't mean it's okay, but the history is not a pretty history. So from a blood recipient's perspective, it's the concern, it's the fear that they have as a potential blood recipient that they might get an infection that they did not expect. Again, the tools today are exceptional. So I think that we really are able to successfully screen with very low probability of risk. But the reason the fear is there on behalf of blood recipients, I don't know that it's specifically related to gay or bisexual men, but just fear of infection. And again, the policy, I think, does create a structural problem, right? It does sort of support this idea that all men who have sex with men must potentially have a higher risk. I think that's wrong. We have to do something about that. But I think it's also important to not let this be only about the perspective of individuals who are not eligible to donate, and about the perspective of people who actually do have to have transfusion.
Thank you for that. So we will move on to more of the policy perspective side. Then we kind of are talking about it already. So the HIV epidemic is actually now in its 40th year. So we have had a couple different, deferral lists in the past years. But why is the MSN deferral still in place? And why has it taken so long to be reviewed? Again, it moved from 12 to 3 months, but it's still 3 months. And so, and it only moved to 3 months because of the pandemic. So I guess, why has it been 40 years and now we're reviewing it? And maybe Dr. Custer could start on this one as well, since you had the advanced study.
Well, I'm going to only start to say that, I had mentioned that I think that there was strong scientific rationale for policy change a long time ago. So I cannot speak to the slow time of change. I can speak to even that change to a 12-month deferral did not happen just because people wanted it to happen. It took scientific evidence. So this is an interesting debate. We have people's personal experiences and we have scientific evidence. The FDA understands, I think, people's personal experiences, but they are only swayed by scientific evidence. And so we did studies to try to change the policy from the permanent deferral to the 12-month deferral. Nobody liked the outcome, thinking that 12-month deferrals was the end of the line. It clearly wasn't. But we started momentum, right? And Jason and GMHC and others really started to get that momentum going. So I guess many times in life, I'm considered a glass is half empty person. On this particular topic, I think the glass is half full. We are clearly gathering momentum. I think potentially to see the 3-month deferral change. The fact that we went from 12 months to 3 months is an absolute step in the right direction. And I think it is based on the FDA recognition that a 12-month deferral wasn't justified. Again, that's not recognized as saying we've reached the preferred objective, but we're moving in the right direction. And so how do we go to the next level of truly individual risk-based approach? So you mentioned the advanced study. I'm happy to talk about that. That's the next set of studies that I hope will be sufficient for the FDA to be able to adopt an individual risk-based approach. But we don't know that answer yet. So we are going to be with the 3-month deferral until such time as the results of that project are done. I'm happy to talk about that now, but I maybe want to make sure that others have a chance to sort of just think about this policy evolution and comment on it before we get into the specifics of what that study is and what we hope it will do for policy change.
Absolutely, yeah. No, we definitely want to talk about the advanced studies because I'm sure a lot of people don't know about it, but I mean, the transfusion medicine side does anyway. Dr. Gammon, I would like you maybe to explain kind of the FDA policies and how they differ from the ABB standards. There's so much, I mean, like we've said, there's so much complexity to blood donations because there's so many standards, there's so many safeguards, there's everything. I mean, it's one of the most regulated environments in a laboratory in general, next to maybe pharmacy or toxicology. So if you want to hit on that a little bit.
Yeah, so there's really, to keep it simple for the group, there's 4 layers of basically guidelines here. There's the Code of Federal Regulations, which comes from the Food and Drug Administration. Those are the law and have to be followed. They're usually very shortly worded. Then there's what are called FDA guidance for industry documents. Those expand on the Code of Federal Regulations. And even though they specifically on the documents, it says they don't carry the weight of law, they become a standard of practice. And in many states, standard of practice becomes the legal standard of care. Then the AABB has ABB standards, and the ABB standards are what a facility is accredited based upon. And actually, I'm just the outgoing chair of the ABB Blood Bank and Transfusion Medicine Standards Committee. And the standards regarding this topic basically mirror what the FDA does. And then finally, there's ABB association bulletins. Those can expand on the standards or they can be clarifications for other topics as well. And then just circling back kind of on a positive note for what Dr. Custer said about the glass half full part. One of the reasons the deferral has been shortened to 3 months, not that that's the end all, is because the testing has become very good. The window period, a period of time when someone's exposed to a transfusion transmitted infection till the tests pick it up is very small now. So that speaks globally to the safety of the blood supply. And it was mentioned earlier by Aaron that the risk now is less than 1 in a million.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, we like to say in the blood community that it's you're more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to get an infection from blood.
There's a nice graph that I show at lectures that says that, and getting back to kind of Dr. Custer's point, the public fears, rightfully or wrongfully, about HIV, hepatitis C, and hepatitis B. Risk is extremely small today, but sometimes people's personal views are shaped upon a generation back when maybe one of their parents needed a blood transfusion back in the 1980s. And it's hard to, they don't understand the changes that have happened today. So
yeah, absolutely. We had a kind of a trial run of this, and Dr. West Mitchell, you brought something up that was very also a good point about the FDA making a policy and then changing it. And so I would like you to speak on that a little bit too.
Are you referring to the fact that they made the change, the COVID?
Yeah, making the change in general is a big thing for them.
Make it, I again, I don't speak on behalf of the US government, but I think either Dr. Gammon or I said this earlier, that once you've put a rule in place, it is very hard. I think FDA, but this is human behavior. I think Daniel Kahneman might have said the same thing. If you put a rule in place, then it tends to be much harder to take the rule back. I mean, once you then change things, and that's inertia. If things start to change, then it becomes easier to change them as well. I think that is also true. That may be part of why, again, I don't work for the FDA, but it may be part of why if you see a 1 year change to 3 months and then to other changes, and we're having this discussion. It's just the kind of discussion that, I mean, I know many of you have participated in panels on this topic in the past, but maybe not all together, and it hasn't been as in the minds of others today. So I think there's some part of it is not even necessarily specific to this topic. I mean, to bring up an unrelated cause for deferral, we were still asking people up to earlier this year, and those of us who have blood banks, it took a little while to make those changes. We had to ask whether people spent 3 months in their cumulative 3 months between 1980 and 1996 in the UK because they might have been exposed to, a prion from eating, even if they're vegetarians, these things. So I'm only bringing that up because it took a long time, and we understand why, but it's just that that was also a deferral that was there for a very long time, and now we've started to have donors who were born after 1996, so they don't even know what we're talking about. They weren't around for it, but I think there are other situations that we have seen have taken a long time to change us.
So on the topic of changes,
Yeah.
so how long does it usually take to change, FDA policies and AABB standards? Anybody can answer this one.
It varies, is probably the short answer. As Dr. West Mitchell mentioned, the policy on CJD was implemented in the first in 1999, updated in 2002. And finally, when the evidence didn't show that there was any risk of transfusion transmission from travel to and time spent on military bases, the FDA reversed the deferral. So as Dr. Custer alluded to, I think once the evidence is presented, then the FDA will go ahead and make their decisions. But again, they don't provide us with timelines. They do send out notices when guidance documents are up for review, but there's nothing set in stone.
Absolutely, yes. Jason or Christian, do you have any thoughts or questions about the policies and whatnot for the transfusion medicine side, or Christy?
Well, I have some reflections, but I want to first be really clear because as you can see, I get emotional about this, that I know all of us are in the same place. All of us very much want there to be a safe blood supply, a available blood supply, and one that is governed by policies that do the least amount of harm to other people. We're all there. What I've heard in the conversation so far is the role that socio-political and socio-cultural norms, ideas, feelings, beliefs can play in public health policy. That's a very real aspect of it. My career is in policy, so emotions aside, I'm very well aware of that. And as was pointed out, related to the change in Haitians not being deferred, what I heard was, and I'm not an expert on this, so please combination of science and sociocultural and sociopolitical pressure around race and racism. Science saying, well, the risk is very low because of the very low proportion of donors overall who are Haitian. And wait a minute, what are we doing? Pointing out a group who also happen to be people of color, and just saying they can't donate at all. And we only have to look at what's happened in this election cycle, right? If not for a court in Texas, parents of trans children could be arrested for having their children have access to what for many is life-saving healthcare. It looks, I'm not, I don't have a crystal ball, but I'd be pretty surprised at this point if, even with a slim majority, a new political party takes control of the US House, which even prior to the election has already said that they will put forth a bill that mirrors the so-called Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. Governor DeSantis handily won re-election. Governor Abbott in Texas handily won re-election. So what does it say about how LGBTQ plus people are viewed in society and are attacked socially and politically? And I think that helps to uncover a lot about why the MSM deferral is in place. I was trying to look when we were talking earlier. I couldn't find the year that NAT testing became available, but I think it was sometime after 2000 or something like that.
1999.
Thank you. So in my perspective, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, from 2015, when the deferral was reduced to 12 months, to 2020, when it was reduced to 3, there was no change in available testing technology. What changed was a really unexpected nationwide blood shortage, which prompted, oh, well, now we'll change this policy. When in fact, it could have been that policy, it could have been 3 months in 2015 or less. It just wasn't for socio-political reasons.
Does anybody have anything to say with that from the transfusion medicine side?
The only thing I could say is that fully agree with Jason's comments about the testing did not change. And, you know, the individual in charge now of Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, Peter Marks, is fairly forward thinking. And some of these were under consideration. I think at least what helped move things along was the pandemic that happened to make the blood and a public health emergency that moved these deferrals from 12 months to 3 months in a quicker fashion. Would they have happened without the COVID pandemic? Probably, but you know, it could have been a lot longer.
All right then, so I'm going to move on to the next question. So we previously discussed why the ban, now deferral, was implemented originally. And as a transfusion medicine person, I know this, but it has been a question that has popped up a little bit. So maybe Christy, you can answer. Why can't people with HIV donate blood to other people with HIV if the same is allowed with organ donations?
That is actually a very good question that I don't actually know the answer to be quite honest. I know that there's rules in place for it, but I don't actually know the reasoning.
Dr. Gammon?
So individuals that donate blood for themselves that have HIV can donate. Now, that's on the blood bank side, but I will tell you, at least from my experience, not all the hospitals will accept blood that's HIV positive. They will state that there's a concern that if there's an error and that blood went to the wrong individual, they could potentially get HIV. My counter argument to that, again, that's the hospital's decision, but if there's appropriate measures that are taken in place, policies are followed, that should not be an issue. So at least on the autologous side, the blood centers do collect blood from individuals with HIV. Most, but not all hospitals accept it. Right now, individuals that are positive for markers like HIV, hepatitis C, hepatitis B, all groups of individuals are deferred from donating, whether they fall into one category or another. So those are the current ABB standards and FDA regulations that are in place.
It's interesting to note that, it's allowed with organ donations though, but not blood supply, which again, I am a blood blinker. So it's, I understand that the hospital side and the scare of essentially using the wrong blood product on the wrong person. I mean, it happens, in the hospital and stuff. Dr. West Mitchell, do you have anything else to say on that?
Yeah, I think the other thing to think about there as well is that there's, risk and benefit have a number of different players, and one of the players is, what's the scarcity of what you're now. Of course, we always say blood is scarce, of course, but an organ, I mean, it's a different level of scarcity entirely. Blood transfusion is a very common. It is the most commonly performed medical procedure in United States hospitals. It's commonly performed, and even though we could use more donors than we have, and we would like more donors to join the pool and stay with us for a long time, it's a lot easier to get a unit of blood than it is to get kidney. So your options are so much more severely limited that I am not saying that I did not make the policy, but I'm thinking it's one of the things that probably went into the decision to say, is this, how much risk can we tolerate in a situation where the scarcity is that much more significant on the other side. So I think that's part of it. It's part of why, as Dr. Hammond was saying, we can do that for autologous blood. Autologous, so your own blood, you can collect HIV positive. That was a big discrimination issue as well. Actually, that was a suit that resulted in the ability for people to do that. But for allo donation, that may be a harder sell to make, just because that risk benefit balance would not be the same as it is for organ. That would be my opinion. Again, I didn't make the decision, but that's something that occurred to me.
Yeah, so this is Brian. Thank you, Dr. West Mitchell. I want to agree with that, and also what Dr. Gammon said. I think it is about organ scarcity, and so I'm not replicating what you just said. When it comes to transfusion, there is one more layer that is important. Not all HIV infections are the same. So you would want to give, if you are going to transfuse, you would literally want to give the same exact genetic identity of HIV infection to another individual, because you don't know what would happen in terms of that could become the dominant infection in the recipient, and you don't want to risk that. So right, there are drug resistant mutations that different HIV strains have and things like this. So there's more complexity there in terms of the potential risk to a recipient that we can't control. And that's, I think, one of the other things that sort of makes people very cautious about the idea of HIV positive donors giving to HIV positive patients.
I think that was a really good point that, a lot of people actually didn't know is the differences, so thank you for that. I'm actually going to wrap up two questions into one because they're kind of similar. So we talked about this in kind of in the beginning, but some countries have shifted in practices by using risk-based assessment questions. So risk-based assessment questions are essentially risk-based, not on gender orientation or anything like that. But why has the US not done this yet? And I will let any panelist talk.
They're waiting for the advanced study, the Food and Drug Administration.
That'll be my next question about
Okay.
the advanced study.
Brian can talk about that further, but they're waiting for more data, is my understanding. And so,
yeah, and I honestly, that is true. But I think realistically, the United States and the FDA, because of its more risk-averse approach, has not been at the forefront of policy change on this topic. Other countries have moved before the US has moved, and the FDA has watched to see what happens. And I'm not saying that that's FDA's strategy at all. It's just the reality of the situation. Long before we moved to a 12-month deferral, other countries adopted a 12-month deferral. Long before we moved to a 3-month deferral, other countries had adopted a 3-month deferral. And I think that's just the same situation with the individual risk-based approach. So yes, there's the countries of Spain and Italy that do a certain kind of risk-based approach. And then there's countries like the UK and now Canada that are using, I think, a model much closer to what might potentially be adopted in the US. But again, that they've been a little more willing. They do have a different system. They approach their regulator with a proposed change and have essentially a negotiation with their regulator. as was discussed by Dr. Gammon, that's not the way it works here. The regulator tells us what the rules are, and then we work within them. So there are some structural differences that mean I think we're always going to be a little bit lagging compared to other settings. It's just, this is the reality of our system of governance with respect to regulated biologic products.
Aaron, I want to jump in and say that our system of governance is wrong. I'm not saying you all don't think that either. I feel like when we talk about terms like risk aversion, it can come across benign, right? Because who doesn't want to avoid risk, right? No, we all want to avoid risk, right? But when is risk aversion not risk aversion? And I would argue that it's not risk aversion when the foundation for a health policy is not really rooted in science, but is rooted in socio-political and socio-cultural fears of the public's response to that policy. And I just, it's so critical that amidst what is a very complex and broad discussion, we not lose sight of that.
That's a good point. And getting back to some of the earlier discussions that Dr. Custer brought up and some of the other speakers, some of this is rooted in what happened when HIV came on the scene in the 1980s. And then a report was published by the Institute of Medicine that kind of led to this precautionary principle and zero risk tolerance in the blood supply that until very recently has kind of driven how things are done in the United States. And right or wrong, that's what was, kind of the mantra at the Food and Drug Administration. There is some, at least in my opinion, some move to get more around science-based and risk versus safety in more recent years, especially with the current administration at the Food and Drug Administration. But you're right. I mean, some of what's happened in the past has driven some of the current policy, and rightfully or wrongfully, it's what's been going on for the last 20 some years.
So we've been talking about this advanced study. So I would really love, again, after all this time, there's a new study, the advanced study that examines the risk factor of MSM donating blood. The study will play a large role in informing the FDA's future policy. And so Dr. Brian Custer was the primary investigator of this study. Dr. Custer, can you tell us about the study, its goals, its current progress, and the significance?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, wow. All right. So first thing to say about the advanced study is it was funded by the FDA. Why is that important? The FDA recognized that they needed data. So I think that that's an important recognition. So what is the advanced study? The advanced study is a project where we are enrolling sexually active gay and bisexual men into a study where we are testing potential questions that could be on a future donor history questionnaire. So these are simple questions like how many sexual partners have you had in a specific time period? So we're asking people to complete these questions. At the same time, we are collecting a blood sample from the participants, and that is being tested for HIV by nucleic acid testing and serology using individual sample formats, so as sensitive as we can possibly make the current available tests. In addition, we are testing for one of the drugs in orally taken pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP. We're testing for tenofovir because that's in most common formulations of oral PrEP. This is all intended to help us understand the current situation with respect to risk and risk behavior in men who have sex with men. The study is being conducted. I'm saying in the present tense, but actually we've finished enrollment, and I'll cover that in just a second, but is being conducted in 8 different cities in the US. That's San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami, Orlando, Washington, DC, Memphis, Tennessee, Atlanta, and also Baton Rouge, New Orleans. We have enrolled just under 1,600 people, and we have finished enrollment. So we finished our last enrollment in September of this year. It's a two-part study. The individuals come in, they do that first assessment with questions, these test questions and the blood sample collection, and then they come back about 3 weeks later when we have all of the laboratory testing done to learn what the test results are for the project. And at that time, we also ask the people to complete a much more detailed epidemiologic behavioral inventory survey. So this is much more the research side of this in terms of collecting stronger or more detailed information. So every participant has done the first visit and the second visit. We've concluded all of that. So we are now in the phase of actually cleaning the data, which is to say finalizing the data set to move into the statistical analysis phase of the project. In the analysis, we will be looking at what was the primary endpoint for the project, which was to say, do these questions, these test questions, differentiate newly acquired infections and newly acquired, sorry, let me restate this. Do they differentiate those who have a newly acquired HIV infection from those who do not? That's what we're trying to answer with this question based on the responses on these test questions. So again, we're moving just into the analysis phase right now. We have been partnering with the FDA all along on preliminary analyses. We will be submitting a preliminary analysis report to the FDA before the end of the year. And then we'll be working in the first half of next year. I hope shorter than the first half, but as quickly as possible in the first part of next year to finalize analyses. The analyses and the findings go to the FDA for internal consideration. The FDA will make the decision about when those results will be made public. I suspect that they will be made public at what is called the Blood Products Advisory Committee, or BPAC, where somebody will present what the findings are and the advisory committee will then consider them. All of that, like I said, I expect to be in the first half of next year. Then is an internal decision-making process by the FDA, and as already discussed by others, we don't have any control over that timeline. They will release potential guidance or draft guidance of the findings and the interpretation. But overall, the advanced study is done. We've enrolled all the people we're going to enroll. I think it is going to be very informative for potentially changing the policy. I don't make that decision, as I said, but I think we have a very strong data set that exactly what the FDA hoped we would achieve with this particular project.
That's very exciting. I'm very excited to see the results of it and all of it. So, and I know it's coming. So I am a big advocate for this entire study. I thought it was well planned and done and needed. But with that, Jason and Christian, has the LGBTQ plus community been supportive of this effort? Or if not, why has there been a reluctance to participate? And maybe you didn't even know about the advanced study, but maybe you would have some insight on why.
I don't mean to jump in because I really want Jason and Christian to be able to talk, but I do want to make clear, to be able to do this study in those 8 communities, we had to partner with LGBTQ plus community organizations to be able to do outreach. So it's going to be a challenging sort of discussion, but I think there are different organizations that have different perspectives on the policy and their willingness to potentially participate. So we approached a number of different organizations. Some wanted to work with us on this project because they thought that it was building bridges, honestly, and others said we don't need more studies of individuals, and there's enough information to be able to make policy change. So I don't know if there's a common voice, but I just want to make sure that everybody has the chance to say what their voice is, but recognize that we did have to work very extensively with community groups in each of those 8 locations to even be able to be successful with this study. This was a true partnership.
I think in my perspective and from what I've seen and heard from my peers who are in the community, I think that in general, the sentiment towards the advanced study is positive. And I've discussed with my peers is that, like, we were hoping that the advanced study would progress, faster and we would have results quicker, because I think that there is a general optimism about the results, and we're hoping that, the results kind of show what we want and think should be the new policy. And I also think that in general, just because I am surrounded kind of by more like sciencey people, obviously, since I am in medical school, that we obviously understand the need that, in order for policy to be changed, it needs to be, especially with the FDA, like you need to have studies, you need to have numbers, you need to have like results. So in general, I would say that the sentiment is that we're not surprised that a study is required for something to be changed, and we're optimistic that the results will be matching with what we feel.
I think that the advanced study, and Dr. Custer, please correct me, was sort of launched publicly in 2020. Is that right? Or was it 2019, 2021?
Yeah, I was going to comment on that in just a second. So the study formally took place from the period of late 2020 through here to September of 2022, but it was designed before then. Most importantly for the study is we had the kickoff meeting with an intent to start this study in February of 2020. We all understand what that means, but I'm going to make it crystal clear. The study has been slow because of the COVID pandemic. We ran head into a wall that stopped us literally with movement control orders from even being able to invite people to come in to be a part of a project.
Thank you, Dr. Custer. I was asking because I just wanted to make sure my math was right, because 19 years before the advanced study was launched in 2001, Italy shifted its MSM blood donation policy from a deferral period to a risk-based screening tool. And while I'm sure I haven't seen every possible study that's been published, what I have seen that analyzed the effect of that policy in peer review found no meaningful increase in risk. So I feel like I'm being that person, but I think it's important just to have that voice, right? Like we can have genuinely positive support for the advanced study and happiness that it is U.S. blood donation policies hopefully moving towards a place where there are no more deferrals that are only specific to MSM. But we also can acknowledge that the United States is not just a couple of years behind. The United States is decades behind. And someone could be, oh, you're being, you're just being negative. You're seeing things as the glass half empty. You're being an agitator. But the Trevor Project is producing some really important data on the experiences of LGBTQ youth, and published recently that based on their data, a LGBTQ youth attempts suicide every 45 seconds, which means that in the 2 hours or a little less that we've been talking about this, about 3 LGBT youth have potentially attempted suicide. Why? Now, I'm not saying that it's solely because of U.S. blood donation policy, or that policy even plays a huge role in all the things that come into creating a context within which our youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers. But I firmly believe that the context that has allowed U.S. blood donation policy to remain what it is and taken so long to change comes from the same place that creates the context for our youth to be so negatively affected, and for our community as adults to carry trauma and all of the negative health implications that we know. Higher risk for substance use, alcoholism, untreated mental illness, you name it. The data shows that our community is affected in that way. Why? For me, this policy is an example of one of the reasons why.
So I apologize because I can be a bit feisty, and I am going to be a bit feisty. I think Italy is not a good example. And the reason why I will say Italy and Spain are not good examples is no other countries followed suit with them. The UK went to an individual risk-based approach in 2020. Canada has adopted one here in 2022. Denmark, or sorry, rather, the Netherlands is still considering whether they're going to move to an individual risk-based approach. Some of those societies have a social cultural context that is very open and accepting. I am not sure I would classify Italy as one. I think there are a lot of layers to that. So there may be an individual risk assessment approach used in Italy, but one would be cautious to say that that would be applicable in other settings. It's also done by medical professionals. What I mean by that is medical doctors do the review as almost a patient level interaction. That would be a profound change in the way blood donors are selected in the United States, a system level change that boggles my mind as one of these people who's been put in the transfusion medicine camp today. So there's a lot to that. And again, the data from Italy is one thing, the data from Spain is another. It's a little more complex in Spain in terms of what the implications are, and I'm happy to talk about that, but I just want to say that many countries did not rush to adopt that individual risk assessment approach used in those two societies, and that continues to this day.
I didn't see that as feisty, Dr. Custer, but thank you for being concerned about that.
So I guess I have a question for you all then, and this is off of our script, but now that we've been talking about this a little bit, and if the research, the advanced study shows to actually make changes, and we were to go more toward a risk-based assessment, maybe a model, like a different model, Canada, in its own way. Would that change the views of the LGBTQ plus community in donating blood, or would there still be like a stigma around it? Would it open it up, or would there still be reluctance in donating blood, even if it was changed?
I'm going to comment from my perspective. I think there would still be a big barrier to come over. I hope that the policy does change, but it is now a policy, as everybody has said, that's been in effect a form of ban or temporary deferral for a very, very long time. We will have to educate and say, we now actually are opening the doors to us. This is not simply change the policy and everything from the past is forgotten and forgiven. It is going to be quite a bit of effort, I think, on a lot of different sides to educate, because people of my generation, like, well, I know I'm not allowed to give blood. I would never go into the blood center. I have a lot of advocates in the LGBTQ plus community who themselves would be eligible outside of this policy, but it's like in solidarity with my MSM brethren, I am not going to donate. So there is a lot of work that is going to have to be done to try to, I don't want to say heal, that's too strong a word, but to change the understanding of who is allowed to donate, even if the policy does change. So I don't know how actually everybody's going to respond to it, but I know that it's going to be work on the blood center side just as much as anybody else's.
Fully agree with Dr. Custer. Yep. You have to go into LGBTQ communities. Just like we have right now, we have certain donor groups that are more hesitant to donate. A lot of times it falls into minorities, and that's going to be the blood center's job to go into those communities and basically tell their story, what's changed, and why can you trust the blood center now?
I think I look at it as,
sorry, go ahead, Christine.
I was going to say, I sort of look at it as negative experience. Anytime anybody has a negative experience donating blood, be it, a miss, be it, any sort of thing, you tend to move away from donating blood because you remember that negative experience. So I think the blood center is going to be challenged with trying to, bring the donors back after creating such a negative experience, as Jason had stated right in the beginning, that's going to be difficult to recover from. And I don't know how to go about that.
I had a question based precisely on what Christy just said, and a little bit to Jason, and I hope it's not, I hope this isn't too sensitive a question, but my question to you, Jason, because of how moving your account was of your first interaction, and I will admit, even the question that you said that occurred to your mind, how did they know? That wasn't something that occurred to me as one of the possible outcomes of that question. It hadn't. Other things had occurred to me, but not that one. And I really appreciate your willingness to be open here. There's a lot of sensitive information being discussed. Acknowledging that, I want to ask you, for example, I mean, even if the policy were to change to an individual risk-based assessment for MSM, right? So for other risk factors, we already do, tattoos, whatnot, okay, but for the MSM specific criteria now, if this were not just to be MSM as a blanket deferral and to say, well, if this and that, have you thought about how you might have felt at that age if you were asked, how many partners have you had? Have you been, whatever else it is that I'm not sure. It's just something that occurred to me. I'm not sure if that would be received better or worse by some people. And I'm also saying this, so I asked the question because of your experience. Maybe today, maybe I don't know how you would have felt if versus back then, if you were asked that sort of question that was more specific. Would it still be kind of seen as, well, there's this drill down list, but for this category, other people don't get a drill down list, or depending on how it's done, if everybody gets the same drill down list, is that, is it still too much information to ask everyone? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that part of the individual risk assessment approach.
Well, I think part of why I was affected so much that's relevant today is that I had no idea what to expect in the screening process, right? And so I think that preparing people for and educating people for what to expect, regardless of who they are and who they have sex with, is an important part. I think it's hard for me to go back and know exactly what would have happened, but what I do know is that at that time in my life, I had not had anal sex yet. In fact, I had not done anything sexual that would be considered high risk, moderate risk at that time in my life. And so I can envision a process that would have helped walk me through what it was, right? And also a process that wouldn't have been, are you a man who had blah, 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 but have you had unprotected vaginal or anal intercourse with someone in the past, whatever, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, right? Like benign, doesn't matter what my gender is, doesn't matter the gender of my partner. It matters, did I do something that within a reasonable window period may have exposed me to HIV in a way that would not be detected in a test. And I think that would have made a really big difference for me. But I really appreciate you thinking that and asking that question. Thank you.
So on the topic of, obviously we're going to have to, the transfusion medicine side is going to have to educate going to these communities, but that's going to be hard, from a Christian or Jason, your perspective. How would a blood center approach this appropriately? We can't just start handing out flyers and saying, hey, by the way, we changed this policy, you're allowed to donate. How can we join our communities together for, a better blood supply, coming from your both experience in the communities?
Christian, I don't want to talk over you. If you have something that you want to add about that.
Yeah, I think with this, it would just require first a lot of outreach and just education. I think that, as was kind of mentioned before, Like, I feel like when people talk about the deferral policy, I feel like people don't always use the word deferral. I feel like the most common word is ban, right? And I think that
Right.
already there's a baseline that there is this idea that most people have, is that like, if you're gay, you cannot donate blood, like, at all. So I think that just educating that it is a deferral is, first off, is very important. And I think that another important aspect would just be sitting down with community leaders and community members and just talking about them and acknowledging the history of the deferral. And I think another important thing is just acknowledging the hurt that the policy has caused. I think that it could be really harmful if, a blood bank tries to go and talk to people in the LGBTQ plus community and is kind of dismissive to the fact that people may be hesitant. So I think that just acknowledging that there most likely is going to be some hesitancy, and in my opinion, acknowledging that that hesitancy is justified, I think that is going to be really important. But I think that the most important part is just going to be education, because I think, right now, I think that a lot of people don't know that this deferral is a deferral. And so if the policy is changed, you'll have to go out and educate even more and let people know that, hey, this thing that you didn't actually know about is actually, like, reversed. So I think that's also going to be one of the challenges.
When I'm eligible to donate, I will happily do so. I'll bring my son with me and my husband. And since I have been a voice in the media of agitation and the need for change, I am also happy to be a voice of celebration, and of being a part of helping a community heal. Because while, I don't think that we benefit from just completely forgetting what happened when that time comes and its effects, we don't benefit from holding on to anger and pain and frustration. And the act of donating blood is an act of giving of oneself in one of the most intimate ways. Obviously, I don't mean intimate sexually, for the benefit of someone that you don't know and would never meet. I think that those acts of altruism create the kind of society that I want to live in, and the kind of LGBTQ community that I want us to have. And I'm excited to be among those standing in line, waiting to give when it's possible.
Thank you for that. I really enjoyed that. And those are really good perspectives. I think it's really good perspectives for the blood community as well. Just like if it will happen, just going in and how to take the best approach. And again, it's reaching out to those different organizations and really working with them and whatnot. I mean, we have to do that kind of with the donor diversity. We have to go into those marginalized communities and advocate and say, we need this. We want you. So a little bit different question, but it applies to, the questionnaire itself. So, even if the study results indicate that, risk-based assessment would be an appropriate step forward, there's no guarantee, and there still is not, that potential donors will be honest about their sex practices, especially if they feel that they do not pose a risk, are uneducated about the potential risks of their sex practices. This is for everyone, as the questionnaires stand right now, as well as the risk of them donating. So how does this impact the safety of the blood supply, since the chances of contracting, it's not just HIV, it's HBC, it's or hepatitis B, hepatitis C, it's so much more than that. For blood is 1 in 2 million. So what are some strategies that are utilized to ensure that donors are informed that the importance of answering these questions honestly? And it doesn't even have to do with sex practices. It's needle use. It's everything. All the questionnaires. It's never perfect,
I'll take that one. So since around 2000, there's what's called the Uniform Donor History Questionnaire. And it's a questionnaire that's developed by the ABB and approved by the Food and Drug Administration that, although blood centers are not required to use, if they don't use it, then they have to create their own questionnaire and have it validated. And so part of that Uniform Donor History Questionnaire are educational materials that are approved as well. And so those educational materials have all kinds of different pieces of information, including risk factors for transmitting HIV and other transfusion transmitted diseases. And if you've been exposed to those, it will tell you that you should not consider donating. I don't remember the exact wording. So donors are given that information to review when they come to donate.
I think one of the other things at a donor center that I had worked at that we had, if somebody chose to donate and if they didn't feel comfortable answering the questions or they answered them untruthfully, there's an opportunity to call the blood center and say, please don't use my donation. You don't have to state why, there's no further
Correct.
questions. You just state, please don't use my donation. So, and that's always been in place. So I think that would be another outlet and would continue to be in place, should it change.
That's a very good point to bring up as well, acknowledging that there is the call centers that you can call. So the next question is kind of, for all panelists. So as right now, as we stand, what actions can us non-researchers take to help advance with fair recommendations? What can we do to advocate for this? What other steps can we do, to help with these policy changes and whatnot, since we're not researchers, we don't have data, but there's things that we can do.
One of the things that Dr. Custer mentioned was that the findings of the ADVANCE study will most likely be presented at what's called a BPAC, or Blood Products Advisory Committee meeting. And those are probably the best opportunities to, if one of those meetings gets called, to contact the Food and Drug Administration and try to get on the agenda as well. So you kind of have the findings of the ADVANCE study. Usually the FDA reaches out to certain communities to try to get their opinions as well, so that this advisory committee then can make a decision based upon the evidence that's presented. So that's probably I'm thinking that would probably be the best place to get the point across. The hardest thing, as we discussed earlier, is with the Food and Drug Administration. They're not supposed to be a political organization, and you can't really lobby them for certain changes. You have to present the scientific data. It goes to the Blood Products Advisory Committee. They make a recommendation, and then the Food and Drug Administration goes back, considers it, and then decides whether or not to follow their recommendation. Most of the time they do, but not always. And so it's different than other countries. As Dr. Custer had very appropriately mentioned, you can kind of negotiate with the regulators. That really isn't the case here in the US.
But to build on what Dr. Gavin said, I think it is an opportunity for anybody to submit public comments. So in addition to the agenda, there is always a part of a BPAC meeting or any other advisory committee meeting where groups who are interested can officially either read a letter or provide information in advance that isn't necessarily read at the meeting. My point being, it would be to pay attention to the Federal Registry for if a
Yes.
Blood Products Advisory Committee meeting is called and this is listed as a topic, then that's usually done a couple months in advance, and it would be the opportunity to make sure that an organization or an individual is on public record with respect to their opinion about not just the advanced study, but the need for policy change in general and related to donor selection practices. That's one way to have your voice heard. Another, of course, is just to reach out to the FDA directly. I think BPAC is a great opportunity because it's an intentional body, specifically convened to listen and think. And the more they hear from the community, the more they will have more perspectives represented.
Well stated.
So where would, potential people who wanted to speak out or organizations who wanted to, speak out, where do they look for this? Like where on the internet is this found?
Well, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, is the arm of the Food and Drug Administration that oversees blood banks in the United States. So that would be the part of the FDA to reach out to specifically.
And so what would all the panelists again, what would you like these future public servants to take away from this panel? Everyone on this panel, we have UBI students, we have transfusion medicine individuals, we have Howard Law students, we have a very vast majority of people who are on this call. So if there's anything that you want to take away from this this panel discussion, what would it be?
I have a few thoughts that are maybe not really what we've talked about today, but it's something that I a feeling that I've had for some time. But I think so we can, this may be totally tangential, but I think I have to say this. Let's not conflate eligibility to donate blood with worth or value. I want to say that because not just in the context of what we're talking about today, just in the context of our normal life, I have interactions with donors and I learn from their perspectives things I wouldn't have anticipated. If somebody gets deferred for low hemoglobin or for having severe vasovagal reactions, that's where you faint because you see anything else. And to me, I would not have anticipated those to have the responses that they sometimes do. But I hear people use words that you rejected me. Goodness, have enough hemoglobin to do this, or you think you may break your nose again, so you don't want to donate. I'm using those examples because they are so different, but I still think it's an important point. I've heard donors express sentiments that sound like they're reflecting value based on whether or not somebody can donate blood. I just think I suspect everybody here agrees with this, but I just want to emphasize again that whether or not somebody can donate blood, whether it's for their safety or a sense of the recipient safety or any other reason, is not a valid statement.
I think going forward too, one of the things is to basically have a more realistic approach of risk versus benefit in putting some of these deferrals in place. As we mentioned earlier, one of the things is kind of the idea of zero risk at all cost for the blood supply, which it did have benefit, I think 40 years ago when HIV came on the scene. But today, in medicine, we use things called like quality adjusted life years. And usually when you put something in place in medicine, you're looking for a risk of around $50,000 to consider it an appropriate benefit to implement. Whereas we're putting, recent tests that have been implemented have quality adjusted life years up in the millions. So, I mean, they're basically putting new tests in that have very little benefit to the blood supply. Other things to look at increase, and I know the Center for Biologics Evaluation is in favor of this, getting pathogen reduction of the entire blood supply. That would certainly be a benefit. But that comes with getting rid of some of the testing that we're doing too, and possibly some of the questionnaires. And then lastly, and Dr. Custer alluded to this, accepting more data from outside the US. Granted, it's got to be valid data, but I think one of the hindrances has been from the Food and Drug Administration, you may have all this data from other countries, but there's been a tendency to have to replicate all the tests and get the data together in the US and present it to the Food and Drug Administration. So I think that may benefit us in the future as well.
Yeah, thank you.
I think one of my biggest takeaways was actually something that Christian had stated. You know, I know in my career and in my job, you know, I'm changing policies and, you know, for the hospital and whatnot, we're always making changes and doing things. And from a scientific type A approach, you make the change and you move on. You make the change and you move on. Christian stated, you know, acknowledge the hurt. And that to me was a very pivotal statement. And it resonated, you know, and it was not something that I had thought of before. And I think that's something that, you know, as we've changed things in blood bank, again, you know, we make the change, we move on, we make the change, we move on. I think this is the opportunity to maybe acknowledge something that, yes, there was historic reasons for it, but acknowledge the hurt that was caused as a result. And I just thought that was a point that stuck with me. So thank you for stating that.
If there's nobody else, we actually have a couple audience questions, so we'll get into them a little bit. So one of them being 1.2 million people are in the PrEP use for HIV prevention in the US. If you have taken a drug to prevent HIV infection, PrEP or PEP, you are asked to wait 3 months from the last use of the drug to donate blood. Was it wrong to expect PrEP to make the ban deferral lifted, because instead there was a double barrier? Would you correct me in my idea?
So I'll speak to the PrEP deferral, and then I'll let Dr. Custer, if he wants to say anything further about the advanced study deferral. So one of the big concerns in the blood banking industry, and I'm making a statement here, not a comment, is that there are studies to say that these medications are very good to prevent HIV in sexual encounters. There are not equivalent studies to show that these medications prevent HIV in the blood supply. And so that's what's led to these deferrals being put in place in the current fashion.
Yeah, so I will build on that. Pre-exposure prophylaxis is such an important tool for HIV prevention, and it has to be recognized and acknowledged for that. But that does not translate to transfusion. So this has been the problem. So I think that the question from the questioner is exactly correct. So I do not see at this point the FDA moving away from a 3-month deferral for taking pre-exposure prophylaxis if it's oral medication, because we don't have enough information yet. This is a classic situation where the science is just now starting to come available. And the concern is this: by definition, pre-exposure prophylaxis is intended to prevent an HIV infection if you use the prescription correctly. If there's a breakthrough infection, if for some reason it didn't work, you could have a very low level of HIV in your system that might not be sexually transmissible, but it could be transmitted in a 300 milliliter blood pack, or so a pint of blood. That's again the concern. It's a theoretical concern, but it's the kind of concern that keeps blood bankers up at night, honestly. So it won't likely change. Again, I think the most important thing specific to the advanced study is that we are collecting some first data of their kind to be available to help contribute to that consideration. And I think it's really, I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I don't know how the FDA is going to interpret it, but we know that we haven't missed a part of the picture. How the FDA interprets it, again, is up to the FDA, not us. But this concern about does PrEP is the right thing to do, and take PrEP, don't be a blood donor. It would be my personal opinion if you're at risk potentially, but it is not necessarily going to. Let me say it a different way. I think we probably are likely going to see adoption of individual risk-based questions. I don't think they're going to exclude, I don't think people who are taking PrEP are necessarily going to be eligible to donate in the foreseeable future, unfortunately, but the data just are not good enough yet for us to be confident that we can address a potential low infectivity issue.
Aaron, for context, I just want to put out that people who are on PrEP are some of the most medically connected people. They are required to, after the initial period, meet their doctor quarterly to take HIV tests. And we found that can more contiguous linkage to care, right? Most of us think, oh, well, I'll go see my PCP once a year and I'm good. Instead, these folks are seeing a doctor at least 4 times a year. I think we know more about people who are on PrEP, and the doctors who support them know more about their health and well-being than people who aren't on PrEP, at least among MSM. And I just think it's an important context. I can't speak to, I don't know anything about low-level infection, and highly respect what the doctors are sharing. I just want to add that along with it.
Oh, and I just want to add on top of what you just said, I did not say what my policy would be if I was policy czar. I said what I think the FDA is going to do.
Right. And we have to follow what the FDA says, but Brian makes a good point.
No, those are all really good points. So there is another question. There's a couple questions we have. And you know, I was before this, I was a manager for a multi-tier transfusion medicine facility. And something that we had adopted was changing the wordage of when females of childbearing age to individuals of childbearing potential. So with that in mind, this is kind of the question that I think maybe is where we're leaning toward is, you know, the getting blood banks and getting transfusion, getting everyone in general, the entire population to understand more of, you know, transgender, gender non-conforming, gender non-binary, the correct terminology. I know we're taking approaches with they, them, you know, but the question is, I've only heard of men who have sex with men with respect to blood donation. Why not just say gay and bisexual men?
So I can maybe answer this question only because this sounds like I'm blaming the FDA. I'm not. They refer explicitly to the policy related to eligibility to donate as for men who have sex with men. And so we adopt that terminology for this discussion around deferrals and eligibility. That does not mean the same thing as we all recognize as gay and bisexual or including transgender. But I just want to be very clear. It's like it's the term that's used in policy circles within the FDA. And so we use it. Many people may indeed be gay or bisexual and not identify as MSM.
But yeah, and I have to just echo what Brian said. I was just reviewing the FDA, the most recent FDA guidance document from August of 2020, and that's the terminology the FDA used. It's a descriptive term, but fully agree with Dr. Custer's comments.
All right, thank you for that. This is a question for, actually, there's 2 questions for Dr. Custer. If it will be necessary to conduct a study on the frequency of certain sexual behaviors among blood donations and the acceptability of blood donors with the alternative questions, as it has been done in the UK and Canada, or will it not be necessary once the advanced study is completed? Or do you not know?
I can't answer this question. And the reason why I can't, right, is that is an FDA decision to make. So I hope it won't be necessary, is what I can say.
Thank you for that. And the second question is, if the advanced study results will be submitted to the FDA, will the advanced study results be submitted to the FDA in January 2023 or later? They're a bit confused, as I had read that the results will be submitted to the FDA in late 2022.
So yeah, let me try, I guess, as best I can to clarify. We did do study visits, so field work for the study a little longer than we expected, but a preliminary report will go to the FDA in December of 2022, so very soon. But the final report may be in early 2023. So that's kind of splitting the difference, but it is the truth about the situation.
Thank you for that. And then the last question is, and I think that, any panelists could really chime in on this, is wouldn't individualized sexual risk questions / screenings for all donors across the board be more beneficial by catching potential high-risk donors of all sexual preference demographics?
I'm going to comment on that just briefly because I think my comment will be the shortest. So as I said, I'm not from America, where I came from, because our risk profile for infectious diseases in the blood supply was not as heavily skewed, actually, I think, to the MSM risk. We had a lot of heterosexual promiscuity and the awareness, as I said, that the blood bank will test. We had that a lot. So we actually used to ask, before I came to America, our practice was to ask all of our donors, in the last 3 months, have you had more than one sexual? In the last 3 weeks, have you had more than one sexual partner? And you answer yes, you keep waiting. In the last 3 days, have you had more than one sexual partner? And if you said yes to that, the things you get points, and you would add to the points, and then we'd have that discussion and say, are you looking for testing, or you just want to donate blood? And we'd talk about what the risks and so on were. So I think depending on your context, it will depend on the culture, it will depend on the environment, it will depend on the awareness, because I think part of why the United States enjoys a voluntary blood donor supply, people know that some things are risk, perhaps, but in a country where we didn't have that much awareness of what the risk might be to a recipient, we did catch people in multiple different orientation groups using that kind of questionnaire.
And the questions would be, in the U.S., and Dr. Custer alluded to this, you have individuals that are donor service personnel that screen large numbers of donors that come through. The questions would have to be pretty cut and dry, be validated, be incorporated in the Uniform Donor History Questionnaire, and then approved by the AABB and the FDA. So, I think carefully worded questions that are go through all those levels of scrutiny could be implemented, but it have to be looked at very closely and I guess basically done right.
Well, we are almost out of time, so I'm going to wrap this up, and I want to thank you all again for this conversation. I think it was really great. I think we all learned a lot, and again, taking the time of your day to come and have this conversation. So again, thank you, everyone. So I hope the webinar has been informative. It sparks each of you to look at this more into this topic. I would like to note that between live viewers and 7 ongoing watch parties at several ASC OUTLaw UBI chapters, well over 100 people have taken the time to be here tonight, which is great. I want to return the topic to the current state of the U.S. blood supply. The blood supply in the U.S. is critically low. It has been since the pandemic. Donations dropped off dramatically during COVID-19 pandemic, which has been declared a national blood crisis. Since then, the supply is still not stable. A severe shortage could require difficult decisions about who shouldn't receive transfusion, decisions with life or death consequences. Eliminating unnecessary restrictions on who can donate could potentially increase the blood supply, again, particularly for MSM. Many countries focus on individual risk factors for infections that can be transmitted through a blood transfusion, not a person's sex or sexual orientation. As we learned, the advanced study is examining the impact of changing the screening questionnaire to ask gay and bisexual men about specific behaviors that raise infection risk rather than requiring sexual abstinence for the previous 3 months. So becoming a donor and supporting the blood shortage is critical to maintaining safe levels of blood. Together, the LGBTQ plus community, blood centers can advocate on donating blood while the FDA determines the next steps after the analysis is complete and the results are made public in months to come. If you can't become a donor, become an advocate if you would. Speak on the issue of the MSN deferral and why blood donation is important regardless. Also, if you want to take action right away, there is a sign up for HACS and UBI's upcoming blood drive with Children's Natural. Another way to support our work at UBI is to keep informed by reading continuous updated material on our website or social media. We post educational things for our chapter members and other people. Future events like this are also in our works. In addition, consider starting a chapter at Howard, consider starting a chapter at a university, or working with a university to start a chapter if you have universities around you. And I am more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Message me at my mail, which I will drop in the chats. And lastly, we are always looking for talented individuals to work with our national team on various projects. If you have any interest at all, we would love you to reach out. I want to thank everyone again for joining and have a very great night.